Here we go. Is it recording? Hi, my name is Scott Simmons. I'm the pastor at Faith United Church of Christ, and I'm here with my friend and colleague, Reverend Daniel Meyers. And what do you do? And yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Meyers. I'm the director of the Center for Faith and Vocation at Butler University, which means I help oversee religious life on campus and as well as secular expressions of community, and also support interfaith engagement and vocational reflection, which are three big things.
Yeah. And I've asked you here today to talk about the fact, I guess, or the suggestion that you are a Enneagram 5.
Yes, at least that's what I've been operating with for a number of years. Yeah.
How did you first encounter the Enneagram?
So when I was in seminary, I did a unit of clinical pastoral education, like many folks seeking ordination will do. And that was part of our work in the hospital chaplaincy experience. And I think I may have heard of it before, but I don't think I knew what I was until that summer, which would have been the summer of 2011, so 10 years ago. And that's where I learned about being a 5, and it resonated. And, I think since then, it's not something I carry every day, but when I am stressed or when I am excelling, or just in a reflective space, sometimes that's where that's a helpful framework to think about how I'm operating and whether I'm working well or not.
Will you describe what a 5 is?
Yeah, I mean, so my understanding, and I feel like there's there's different ways these are framed, and some are framed in much more religious kinds of language, and some are framed in more like social psychology kinds of ideas. The way I interpret my 5-ness is I am, if left to my own devices, I am going to be up in my head. I'm going to be thinking about things. That makes me thoughtful, but it also means sometimes I'm distant. It can mean that I am already analyzing rather than present. So being present is sometimes a challenge where I'll be reflecting backwards or forwards rather than grounding myself into a certain moment. There's a scarcity concern. I think this is true for a lot of 5s. It's true for me. One of the moments that has resonated with me that continues to be important was at my divinity school program. Halfway through the 3-year program, you had a meeting, like a conversation with your mentors that was guided by one of the deans of the school. And it was this really kind of reflective opportunity to think about what you've done so far in this educational experience and what you need to do next. And my long-term mentor from the chaplain at my undergrad was invited into that conversation. And she actually was out in the area as well. And the question she asked, and this again is like 9 years ago, but I still remember it. The question she asked is, what do you need to do to see abundance in the vision of your call and in the vision of where you're heading with your ministry? And abundance is the word that counters scarcity, right? So, yeah. And at that point, I hadn't really delved into my 5-ness a ton yet, but as I look back at that question, I think the reason it keeps sticking with me is because it is the question I need to keep asking, like, where is the abundance? Don't only just assume everything is scarce, whether it's, job opportunities or relationships or, just things working out. There's just a lot of anxiety underneath a lot of that about how things are. There's a limit to what's going to happen, and I sometimes live in those limits and need to blow them up.
Yeah. It's interesting because 5, 6, and 7s are the head type, and what they hold in common is this core emotion of fear or scarcity, like something's missing, and there's somebody in our church, a guy named Josh Hall, who is a 6, and he's shared on several occasions how he works in the ER, and he just sees all the horrible things that can happen, right? And so he was reflecting at one meeting about how did his work form him as a 6, as somebody that has kind of this like scarcity sort of thing, or was he naturally that way? But like a thinking type, right, can imagine how everything can go wrong, or imagine the limits maybe more than other types.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes sense to me. And I think the other thing that I have really internalized around the Enneagram in general, and my experience of it as a 5, is like, so when stressed, there's like an opportunity there. And some folks, when stressed, will, I think there's the term shadow traits, or you kind of hunker into certain things that feel very comfortable, but often whatever number you are in the Enneagram, often like don't serve you well. And so for me, if I'm going to do that, it's going to be about isolating. It's going to be about not seeking conversation, dialogue, consensus, but more like going into my own space and giving into those worries and concerns about limits and scarcity. But the thing that pushes me out of that is the 7.
Yeah.
And the 7 is like, extremely, optimistic and active and very present. And I understand your church community has gotten to experience my wife as a guest.
I was going to say, Jana's a 7, isn't she?
Jana's a 7.
Hardcore.
So like when I was, I remember, I think my first year out of seminary, we had both gotten jobs in New York City. And I remember in our New York City apartment, I was reading about the Enneagram. And I was reading about 5, and I was reading about 7. And I told her, I think you might be a 7. And I was reading this. And while I was reading it, she was doing laps around our table in this tiny apartment to get her steps up on her pedometer or whatever. And it was just like, yeah, you can't sit still.
Yeah.
So, but what's beautiful about that is, so the person that's most closest to me in my life is modeling for me what I need to reach towards in order to win stressed in particular. So living with a 7, being bound to a 7 in all of my journey, like, it's a good thing. So
yeah, she's the 7 is sometimes called the enthusiast. And like the first time I met Jana, I was like, this woman's enthusiastic. Wow.
Yeah, she only knows how to read and write and speak in exclamation points.
That's great. When we were talking earlier, I shared with you what at least Richard Rohr claims to be the root sin of the 5, which is greed, or avarice, which I don't really have a thought around that word, but greed makes some sense. And it wasn't so much like a financial greed, but other forms of greed, of like time and energy and what have you. Where does that land for you? Does that make any sense, or is that one hard to see in your own life?
It makes sense. Like, if you're really concerned about scarcity and you're anxious, what are you going to do? You're going to hoard things. You're going to hold on to stuff. So like, I'm the kid who would save my allowance, for nothing. Like, I didn't have a plan for it, but I wouldn't spend it because who knows when I'll have more $1 bills. So I used to have this like book that I didn't read, that I cut out the inside of and put all my ridiculously tiny amounts of money for my allowance into this book. I don't know if that's like, the greed there is not so much I need to have all the money, but it's I need to save everything. Like, I need to secure everything. And it comes out of, I think, anxieties. I think more as an adult, like, where I see this is more on like wanting to make sure, I'm trying to think if there's a good example, but thinking more about securing the resources, securing this, not wanting to run out of stuff. Oh, so here's like an example. So like I'll like order new clothes and like a new shirt or something, but I won't get rid of the old ones. And so I'll get this closet that's like getting ridiculous because I'm always thinking like, well, I might use that someday, or I might want that, or what if the one I just bought, I get a stain on it. So like I think there's another like way of being, which is more thoughtful about resources and trying to also share more and like make efforts to, like, if you're getting something new, to bring something out to where the community could need it and stuff like that. And my mind will sometimes first go to, well, let's save it. And I think that's indicative of a worry that there's going to be not enough someday. And I guess that's the permeation of greed, I think.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's been really helpful for me as I've been diving into the Enneagram is the idea that we all have a primary type, but we all also share all the types, and there's a positive and negative to that. So like the fruit or the spirit of the types, and we'll talk about that for fives in a moment, but we can all share in those. But as you were talking about the clothes thing, I know what you're talking about. Sometimes like I still like, because I just moved, I had to just get rid of a lot of stuff. And I still will go into my closet and I'm like, got like 3 shirts that really are overused and should be gone. You know what I mean? Like, and I'm holding on to them. Why? And it's not a sentiment. It's not because I'm sentimental about them. There's a little bit of that in my type, and some people that's the motivation. It's rather what you said. It's like, well, I mean, I might need this shirt. Like, what if I don't, like I'll work in it, or I might need it for this. And it's like, no, just, you're going to be okay. Like,
yeah. I think and there are probably other more significant examples than clothes, of course, but like the impetus to save. So I think there's a critique of generosity in a 5, and that tails well with the greed language. Like the impulse might be to save and keep rather than be generous and give. And I think that's something I notice in some of how I orient and need to reflect on more. And also, and the other thing I like about the Enneagram, at least it's been true for me, is intentionality matters. So if you know what your impulse is and even can see some of the why behind it, you can simply be intentional about doing the other thing. So that's helpful in behaviors, but also in sort of thought processes and anxieties too. So if if I know I'm gonna tend to be like worried initially or live in limits, I can just be intentional about critiquing that. Or if I know I'm gonna want to save something, I can just be intentional. Like Jana and I, when we do our budget, we always try to think about, we do have a line for where we're giving. And
and that's like really healthy for everybody to give, but for somebody struggling with kind of your personality type, that is a thing that can really be a catalyst for growth.
Right.
Like for me, one of the things that as a 3 that is really, really healthy is to speak about my failures. I hate it. And I can spin it and it looks like a success, but it's been probably some of the most important moments of my life where I've just named them as a failure. And there's even one where somebody was like, oh, that wasn't a failure. And I'm like, no, I need to claim it as that. Like something about that feels good. And, we were talking a little bit about Zacchaeus, and you think about him, right? What does he do after his encounter with Jesus? He gives abundantly. It's like, if I've defrauded anybody, I'll pay him back 4 times. Right? Like that's really risky behavior for a 5 type.
Well, and I think where faith comes in, like, so if anxiety is part of my experience, then I think the spiritual underpinning of where new life is to calm those anxieties, right? So like a good 5 story for me might also be like Peter out on the water in the storm, and like the role that Christ or that faith can have in being, this particular unexpected, unexplainable uplift, breaker of expectations, deconstructor of limits. That's life-giving. That's where spirit moves for me. And so much of, I think, my sort of spiritual practice and sort of orientation will be looking for ways that my expectations have been broken or overcome, right?
Where there's been that kind of abundance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. The story that you brought up of Jesus, and he quiets the storm, right? So they're all fearful, and there's like a scarcity of safety. And then he wakes up and he's like, quiet. He's like, what's your problem, everybody? And somehow he knew that there was more safety at hand than they were experiencing, right? He's like sleeping on the cushion. And yeah. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been really well educated and had good experiences in my schools. I've had some good jobs. I've married an amazing person. I have 2 amazing children. I'm not saying all this to tout my horn or anything, but that's the spiritual evidence that I have to confront with myself sometimes. Like, where is this season of your life where everything's been missing and you've had to worry about scarcity in a real way? It isn't there, and many of the things that I'm concerned about, God has confronted me with over and over again. Like, no, I'm gonna bring blessings. I don't think all of life is that, and I certainly know my experience is not the same as everyone's, and I have a tremendous amount of privilege. But the idea of anxiety, I think, is fairly common. And for me, the confrontation with reality can be a spiritual thing of like, oh no, like if I look at what God is doing, it doesn't always square with my 5 instincts, right?
Yeah.
And that could be a space of growth as well.
I think that's the fruit of the spirit of a 5, the objectivity, like to really be able to step back and go, what's really going on here? Let me kind of weigh it out and see. And then that overcomes that like base emotion of fear or scarcity. One of the things that 5s are described as is that they can be really great listeners and counselors. And having done some counseling myself, I know that really listening intently is a form of generosity to somebody. I was wondering how that, if that is a trait that you find in yourself, and how that's played out in your ministry and work.
I hope so. A small part of what I might do on a regular basis is meeting with individual students, whether it's for a spiritual care or vocational conversation, or just we have several students who are interns, and we are supervising and guiding them. And we also do different programs on leadership and mentoring. So all those are like conversation-based experiences. I teach a class, I have office hours, and might find a student who wants to just talk about something with the class. So I think being able to listen and actively listen, right, is pretty essential to a lot of those different conversations. And I also think the challenge for me in it is the 5, right, will want to start analyzing, start going somewhere else in my mind. So I don't know if you or folks in your community would be familiar with Martin Buber's I and Thou. I actually have a copy of it right there. The idea of how we can, the I and the thou are two fully formed humans engaged in a relationship. And what sometimes a five might do using Buber's language would be to turn I into an it. Instead of I, thou, would be I, it. And to sort of analyze and compartmentalize this other part of the conversation or the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And the book has a lot of like theoretical frameworks about how to refrain from converting your moments of human intimacy into like full distance, like full separation, and turning your humans into its. So that's something I think that's been really important for me, is I haven't thought about this in a while, but the I, thou kind of language. And so in the listening work, to make sure the person sitting across from me is remaining a thou in my head rather than a to-do list or an item or something on my calendar for now and then moving on, like keep it human.
Well, that's I think it was Rohr that said that fives, they're one of the few types, or maybe the only type, where their great strength is also their great weakness. And the strength is the objectivity that you can step back and really like think things through and have like some real wisdom of seeing how everything fits together. Yet at the same time, what I was hearing you kind of getting at is like, there might be a tendency to be listening to somebody, but they've become they become an object, something to analyze or to see at a distance, rather than this living, breathing, human being, yeah.
So the objectivity of stepping back can be helpful, but sometimes there might be a tendency to objectify and turn a relationship into an object. And I'm probably misrepresenting Buber a bit here, but yeah, that's an essential question, I think, for me at least, is how am I listening, and what in different relationships, what's the role of the listening? Sometimes it's simply to listen, and sometimes it's to synthesize and make a probe or make a suggestion. So I do think that's definitely part of it. When I was deciding to go to seminary, I was teaching high school science, and my language for why I wanted to go to seminary was not to be a pastor, but to be a chaplain. And I thought hospital chaplain, because hospital chaplains are working one-on-one with families in those very relational, conversational kind of spaces. And that's the part of teaching I liked. I liked tutoring and like the after school kind of conversations over the let me lead this whole class kind of experience. So I think that's very five as well. Like, I don't want to be at the front, like leading a whole thing, but if I can find a way to be present with individuals, that feels much more energizing. And so I think my trajectory has been shaped by that. Listening, like I want to be a listener. I want to be in those kind of spaces. It's been shaped by that as well.
Yeah. I want to be up in front of the class.
Yeah.
But it's this experience I'm having of interviewing different types has been so life-giving, and I'm not even halfway through. But as I hear you talk about pieces, I'm seeing things about myself, and I'm like, well, I do really appreciate the one-to-one piece and listening to people. And I don't know that this is what you're saying, but I had a tendency, because I like theory and thinking, I did hospital, like a residency, chaplaincy, and it's like I was with the patient, but I was also working out my theory on patient care at the same time. And that could be helpful or be competing with my care. It could contribute or compete with my care in the moment. And I had to be aware of that, because there was something in me that just also, right? Like, let's be real. Like when you're with somebody who's suffering, sometimes it's hard to stay present because it's just painful. So I would just go to theory as a way to create distance and protect myself.
Right.
Right. Those were the moments I wasn't being a very good chaplain, I don't think.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
for with respect to suffering, like I think the person who can be a really good listener is also obviously got some potential for empathy, and building empathy and being able to share in empathy. And I think that's true of fives. But if you're listening only from or predominantly from an analytical place, and so you're talking to somebody who's struggling or suffering, the empathy might be lost, right? Like you're not going to feel what they're talking about in the same way. So I also think so I serve on the board for the Center for Interfaith Cooperation here in Indianapolis. And one of their core values is promoting understanding and empathy across different faith traditions. And I love that word. And I think it's become a big part of sort of my values is how do I seek empathy from others? And I think there's part of the five that needs to be intentional about that. So something that's also worth thinking about is what are the commitments I've made or anyone has made that set you up to lean right into the places of challenge that you need to be leaning into. If I joined some kind of academic society where we all read books individually in our cubbies and then only sent reports about it, that would not be good for me. Like
you'd probably enjoy it, but
I need to lean into spaces that are going to encourage fostering interaction and creating like sort of new ideas and new relationships, and also like visibly challenging like concerns of that there's not enough.
Yeah. It's I came across a resource that I think some church put together, so God bless them, and it talks about downstream practices for each type and upstream. So the upstream are the harder ones. The downstream are the natural ones. So the downstream is inductive Bible study and reading books. So that's like naturally easy for a five. And then the upstream is sharing. So,
Just sharing
and serving, because it's fives need to carve out a space in their schedules to intentionally share themselves with others. And again, right, like when I first saw greed, I was like thinking money or whatever, and the sharing here isn't like stuff primarily, is like sharing you. And then the serving, it's like they're prone to secrecy and introversion. They must learn to get out of themselves and move towards others. Regular acts of service provide a context for whole person transformation, head, heart, and hands. This is crucial for the emotional and spiritual health of fives. So, for what it's worth.
So as you're doing these interviews, I want to ask you a question. How are you reflecting on your role as a minister when you know you've got so many different types of people in your community who are concerned about different things, need to lean in different directions, view community and relationships in different ways? Is it feeling, how does that feel? And I could imagine there's like an overwhelmingness to it because it's impossible to meet all these different types in everything you do, but it also could be insightful, I'm sure.
There is what I'm beginning to see in doing the series and trying to draw a conclusion, right? Like a solution's the wrong word, but some sort of application is I'm finding that what I understand to be the gospel in its own different slice to always be the answer to each type. So like I've done twos, they have a need to be needed. And ironically, like a two is one of the most giving people on the planet, yet their root sin is pride. And they can get to a place, there was a statement, somebody gave a testimony, they're like, at my worst, I don't need God, God needs me, right? Like I'm such a giver. And so then encountering God is actually the one that is the true giver and that can provide for a two's needs. Because twos tend to give to everybody else and then they're not taking care of themselves, right? Or like the three that like I have a need to achieve. That's my type. And so I post Nicodemus as an achiever, and he believes that achievement brings God's acceptance. But the gospel is, God accepts us, loves us, not because of what we've done, because of whose we are. Right. Like, and so just going down the line, I don't know what it is quite yet for the five. And so that's, it feels weighty. But I knew everybody was different. What is helpful is becoming more aware of my view so that I can be more intentional of not trying to see others through my eye. Does that even make sense? Not trying to see others through my eyes or assuming that you see the world the way I do, right? Being more curious of like, oh, here it is. And so then I think that the gospel message of grace, it speaks to each type, but maybe I might become more helpful, successful, and being able to share that message in a way that speaks to that person. Yeah, I don't know, man. Sorry, that was like that answer. It was a great question.
Well, I mean, the same thing for me. Like anyone who's in community, I mean, this is humanity, right? Like everybody, it's just such a complex experience of how different everybody is and how do we meet so many needs. But I would imagine like kind of going through your own congregation with this particular framework of 9 identities. It's got to be kind of like interesting, and people who are super familiar, right, will like peg people, oh, you're a 5, so therefore, and generally that tends to hold. So it can form.
That's really good, because it is something that as I've gotten into this and I've gotten some feedback from a few trusted people, and it's helped me think about, look, it's good to know a type, but people are more than a type.
Of course.
Right. And I think that identifying somebody's type, I think that we can indeed be better at loving them, but also always carrying the potential that they're more than this, right? Like that we're not going to just put somebody in a box. Like human beings ultimately don't fit into a category. And that's been really helpful. At the same time, I had a fella come in who wanted to talk about his type, and it was really useful. I think it seemed to be that he was finding it useful to think about his life experience and what he might do to find kind of what he needed in this next season by using it.
Yeah.
Right. Like very fruitful framework for the counseling piece. So we'll see, that's the thing. I would like to, like, it's good that we're spending 10 weeks and we're having small group discussions and interviews and all that. So
cool. Yeah, there's a group here that has used, one of our student groups has used the Enneagram a lot on their own community, like relationships and dynamics. And what's kind of fun is once everybody's kind of familiar with the language, you can like have these really deep conversations pretty quickly, because it's like everybody knows what we mean by different things. It becomes placeholders for larger conversations, and it's kind of cool. So I think it's a neat idea what you're doing this summer. glad I can represent a 5, though I can't believe that you don't have them. They must all be hiding in the corners doing
Yeah, they don't want to be intruded upon.
or they get your email and they're like, oh, I don't have time for that. I have to
Yeah.
hoard my time. So
Yeah. We're calling you out, healthy 5s. Come on
yeah,
now.
right. You're out there somewhere.
Well, I believe that too. Daniel, I thank you for your time. I wish you could join us in person. I wish you a good vacation in the month of July.
Oh, thank you.
And yeah, you'll have to come visit sometime. Did you come when Jana preached?
No, usually it's like childcare
Mm-hmm.
for me on Sunday mornings. So
Gotcha.
different communities are opening up and have different child options, then
Yep.
I'll be starting to come out a bit more, I think.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have ours in full swing by August. So
Awesome.
maybe we'll see you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right. Blessings.